Red Bull have found a way to investigate the advantage that McLaren have gained over the past couple of races, and it looks like it could be one of the most bizarre ways if the Austrian team manages to prove to the FIA that the Woking-based squad have gained a lot of performance in an illegal way. While many were focused on the looks of the cars, especially the bodywork, as well as the front wings, McLaren has played in a bit of a grey zone with the brakes, and Red Bull has noticed this and sent an immediate report to the governing body of the sport. But with the FIA deeming the solution legal in the last two races, is there any truth behind these accusations? And if so, how big of an advantage can McLaren gain through this innovation? The current regulatory era is very strict on the F1 teams, not allowing them to change basically anything on the car and working under a very strict rule book. But that doesn't mean that the teams will stop inventing all of a sudden. Quite the contrary. McLaren have suddenly found themselves half a second faster compared to where they were in the beginning of the season from Miami onwards, and Red Bull believes that this is because of a trick they used with the brake discs. To make things much clearer, every car is allowed to have a hole that is located near the front and the rear brake discs during the practice sessions on Friday, and from Saturday these holes must be covered. They are initially open so that the teams would be able to gather data, but that's not allowed during the third practice session, the qualifying as well as the race. And in the last two races, pictures have circulated that the MCL38's brake discs looked quite suspicious. They'd covered it with duct tape. Although this is more or less legal because they are basically covering the hole, it has only been noticed on the last two races where the British team struggled to maintain the pace on much older tyres compared to the rest of the grid, whereas in races like Imola this was a huge advantage of the car. Sure, in Austria Norris managed to close the gap on the hard compound tyre, and with the medium one he caught up quite quickly to Verstappen, but the Dutchman was on a used set, and this is something that helped the Brit quite a lot in his quest to put the fight right up to the neck of the three-time world champion. Even in 2023, when it was obvious that Red Bull was going to be the dominant force from the start of the season, the other teams weren't sitting down when it came to innovations that they believed were illegal. Aston Martin had to fix the front wing around the nose area and make it more firm because it was believed that under certain speeds it could flex and ultimately break the rulebook of the FIA. The same was believed for the 2024 version of the Mercedes front wing, one that is seemingly still under investigation by Red Bull, even though Wolff is adamant that everything is legal and has been proclaimed so by the governing body. The tape duct over the brake discs is something that bothered Red Bull to the extent of them sending an official complaint to the FIA, but in order for us to understand this issue to a greater extent, we need to look at the performance of the tyres from these two teams. McLaren was much better than Red Bull on older tyres, as I mentioned earlier, on tracks before this complaint was made, such as the ones in Miami, Imola and Barcelona. The older the tyres, the faster the car, a phenomenon that may have attributed to the fact that the MCL38 is just a car that behaves much better when being lighter due to the lower weight of the fuel. However, Red Bull believes that there is more hidden behind this. An official report from Automotor and Sport said that the complaint was made before the last two races, and while we can yet again make the argument that the MCL38 was one of, if not the fastest car on the grid during these two events, it's safe to assume that with the addition of Mercedes in Silverstone, it was definitely a close fight between these two teams as well as Max Verstappen. But even though the Austrian win came more or less on luck, the fact that Mercedes was a lot faster in Silverstone is reinforcing the belief of Red Bull that McLaren did benefit for a while with not covering the holes at the brakes in the events I mentioned before. Now it's up to McLaren to prove that all of this is a farce and that the Austrian team is trying to put a lot of dirt to their name because of the fact that the RB20 lost the dominant edge and are no longer able to find significant upgrades to their car. Obviously, gaining more than a half a second compared to the leading team with just one upgrade package is always going to look a bit suspicious. But if we're to look at the development of Mercedes, you could easily understand that the teams finally know what they are doing with their cars, and therefore Red Bull cannot always hope on the Verstappen factor in order to keep the competitive edge on their side. And this is one of the primary weaknesses of the team, which is why they are looking for ways to stop the rest of the grid from progressing in a rapid manner in the same way that they managed to build a competitive edge compared to the rest of the grid back in 2022. Unlike Red Bull, the rest of the grid are now in firm belief that they could add more performance to the car, and even though Wolff stated that we shouldn't be expecting the old days of glory to be back in a blink of an eye, it's still something that is definitely going to add more towards an interesting season, especially in the next two races that are held on European ground. However, these small pecks from one team to another are something that we should be expecting quite a bit of, especially after Zak Brown went after Red Bull and called the team a pretty toxic environment, and one that currently has a lot of engineers sending their CVs left and right due to the departure of Newey. Of course, the Austrian squad can only blame themselves for chasing a new development and philosophy of the car and not finding what they were hoping to, even though they haven't regressed a single bit and have added a lot of performance to the car. But according to the engineers from the Milton Keynes squad, they haven't quite listened to Newey when he had some solutions about some of the underlying issues that were masked thanks to the strengths that the RB18 and the RB19 had. And just because McLaren taped the brake ducts, it doesn't mean that they have become a nerfed team by the FIA. Quite the contrary. In the last two races, they were quite fast, and even faster than the RB20 if we are to compare them on the different conditions that persisted in Silverstone. If we look at the first stint on the medium tyres, Verstappen lost ground to both Norris and Piastri on pure pace, and therefore blaming the brake duct hole is simply not holding up, because even Verstappen himself said that the team can't use the excuse of "we've reached the ceiling and we can't find any more performance out of the car just because the others are catching up." Obviously, Verstappen's comment could be the best one that can be added in this entire situation. And when talking about the RB20 and reflecting on the comments that have been made by senior figures like Christian Horner and Pierre Wash, the three-time world champion went on to say, "I refuse to believe we can't get any gains because then you get lazy. I'm confident that everyone within the factory is always pushing flat out to try and bring bits of performance to the car. But clearly, there are a lot of smart people in the world on other teams that are doing the same thing. Naturally, it would always help to have more time, but that is how the rules are, to try and slow down the winning team. Obviously, when you are the ones chasing, you are happy that it is like it is. And of course, when you are the ones leading, you're being caught up during the season and you naturally look at it like it's not what you want. But that is how the rules are written. All of these comments are made in a very sensitive period where Red Bull is struggling to keep competitiveness at the highest level possible. And with drivers like Perez underperforming heavily and opening the door for teams like McLaren and potentially even Mercedes, the Austrian team is now under heavy risk of dropping to P3 in the Constructors' Championship if Verstappen doesn't win the majority of the races in the season. This is also a solid reason for them to try and look for loopholes that the other teams might be utilising in their own favour, and the latest one with McLaren, while likely to be unfruitful, is a clear sign that Red Bull will try to slow down their rivals in a way that they have been slowed down by teams like Mercedes in the past. With all of this in mind, do you think that Red Bull's comments towards McLaren's brake ducts are legitimate ones? And more importantly, do you think that the investigation from the FIA will prove that there is something illegal happening in McLaren, the team that managed to challenge Red Bull all of a sudden with one upgrade package? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and once you've done that, have a look at the video that's on your screen right now.